I'm thrilled to hear this group of experts unpack what we need to heal as we embrace this rapidly growing industry. And with that, it's my pleasure to introduce CJ Ciaramella, the moderator for Get Up, Stand Up, Can Cannabis Heal Our Broken Criminal Justice System?
Hey guys, great. We got a really great panel here. My name's CJ Ciaramella. I'm a reporter for Reason Magazine, where I cover criminal justice, things like sentencing and policy, policing. I've also written for such venerable publications as Vice and High Times. Before I go any further, I'm going to let everyone go down the line and introduce themselves, a little bit about them and what they're here for. So, Niambi?
My name is Niambi Tosh. I am the daughter of reggae legend Peter Tosh, and I am also the sister of Jawara McIntosh. And so I think that a lot of us have heard, communities that have been affected by this war on drugs. And when I think about my brother's story, I think that it's very important to understand what that looks like and what that felt like for my family. When my brother was arrested in New Jersey in 2013 on Father's Day weekend, we got a call, and just knew that he was arrested. And I just thought that this thing would kind of pass. And it wasn't until 6 months later when he had his first hearing in court. And so he sat in a jail with, other inmates and had to stay there for 6 months before he even knew what he was charged for. During that time, we showed up with my family, my mom, and saw him shackled into a room in an orange jumper, and correctional officers just very rude to families and very rude to just the inmates. And that's when we heard the prosecution say that, would you accept a 20-year plea? And it was mind-blowing to think that, wow, that's when it was real. Like, that's when it's real, that this is what's happening in communities. And so 3 months later, he finally was able to make bail, but it wasn't until even in that point he was affected. And so he went back and forth to New Jersey for 3 years, pre-trial, going back and forth where we live in Boston, and then finally accepted a plea, just wanting to get this behind him. And so he accepted a plea in December of 2016. And then in January of 2017, he actually turned himself in and went back to jail. He was expected to only serve 6 months. A month and a half in, he was brutally attacked by another inmate in jail and suffered a severe brain injury. To this day, he's still in the hospital and unable to communicate for himself, unable to do anything for himself. He was an advocate himself for cannabis. He was also heavily spiritual, a musician as well, and he also is a father of 4 children. And so when you look at kind of how families are affected and what that means when you hear kind of that phrase that's being thrown out throughout this panel, I want you to really understand when you hear about that incarcerated population, it's more than we can imagine, and it's a lot worse than what we think. And so I think that understanding how to now change policy to affect these families in a positive light and to really bring these families out of this devastation that it is. We have to think, a lot more critically about how to support, other people that are in this situation.
Hi, I'm Clark Neely. I'm head of the Criminal Justice Department at the Cato Institute. Before that, I was with a libertarian public interest law firm called the Institute for Justice, where I litigated constitutional cases for nearly 20 years. I think what I want to share with you is that it's extraordinarily important to understand what we've done both to the Constitution and to the institution of our criminal justice system by enforcing marijuana laws. When you authorize the government to do violence to people, when you authorize the government to put people in cages for no good reason, and I think an increasing number of people are now realizing that that's the case with marijuana prohibition. There is no good reason for criminalizing that activity. There's no good reason for doing violence to people who do not obey that law, and there's no good reason for incarcerating or even killing people who have violated those laws. We're now realizing that. There's a lot of us who've known that all along, but other mainstream politicians are beginning to acknowledge it now, and leaves us with a number of very difficult questions. And we'll talk about some of those today, but some of the questions are, how do we go forward? What do we do about the past? What do we do about people whose lives have been ruined through the enforcement of a completely pointless law? And how can we begin to repair our justice system and begin to repair the relationship between law enforcement and the communities that law enforcement was meant to serve when they have devoted so much of their effort and so much of their attention to enforcing a fundamentally unjust and immoral law? I think we can't give up, but we also have to recognize the difficulty of the path ahead.
My name is Kayvon Kalatbari. I'm a 2019 candidate for mayor of Denver. Also a business owner across a spectrum of businesses. I have about 13 that cover the space of cannabis in 5 states, comedy production, arts magazine, a bunch of other things. Started as a cannabis policy reform volunteer about 13 years ago is how I got involved in the industry in Denver. And that was my entry point into more than just the consumption side of things. And as my businesses grew, I always had them act as advocates for drug policy reform and the decriminalization of other public health concerns like homelessness and sex work and things of that nature. And as I've gotten further into the cannabis space and worked with larger companies and more folks with means, which we'll talk about more later. The path of the cannabis industry right now is a very unfortunate one when it comes to the regulated side of things and the lack of participation we have by folks that have been really disenfranchised by the war on drugs over the last several decades, that I'm starting to divest some of my interests in the business side and focusing more again on my advocacy. Part of that is being the chairman of the board of the Minority Cannabis Business Association, which created state model legislation last year and is now working on municipal ordinances that help our lawmakers understand that just because we've legalized doesn't mean that we've fixed things, and that there's a lot that we need to undo to garner participation for people of color, especially in ownership and also in support roles. But also that our monies, our tax monies that we collect that are often, especially in Colorado, being wasted and spent very inappropriately, that those monies go to help positively impact the folks that have been really thrown under the bus by the war on drugs. And that's part of this mayoral campaign as well, is getting beyond a lot of what we're seeing in Denver, which is a microcosm of what we see in the country, which is this corporate Dem neoliberal mentality of money first and special interests first and people last. And I'm hoping to help interject some life into a different conversation there.
My name is Shalene Teitel. I'm a commissioner for the Massachusetts Cannabis Control Commission, which is the state regulating agency that is implementing the legal marijuana program there. And the somewhat unusual path that I took to get to that point was as an activist over the past 15 years. I started out as a college student in the movement with Students for Sensible Drug Policy. And as many speakers and audience members here, I'm sure, are also a part of. And so I stayed with Students for Sensible Drug Policy through my master's degree and my law degree. And when I graduated, I joined the movement full-time. I was lucky enough to work on the Colorado campaign to legalize marijuana for the first time. I also briefly practiced marijuana business law. And then I really wanted to find a new way to help get the marijuana industry more diverse and to get more women and people of color matched up with opportunities. So I co-founded a diversity and inclusion focused recruiting firm. And then, as part of the Minority Cannabis Business Association, I worked on a model bill to help provide a process of reinvestment and reconciliation in state policy. And so part of that was used as an inspiration in the Massachusetts ballot question and bill in 2016, which provided that the regulating agency would find a way to promote and include communities that had been disproportionately harmed by the war on drugs into the industry, but it didn't specify how. And so I helped to write that language, and then the joke was on me because I'm now part of that regulating agency that has to decide how to do that. And so my current position is broadly working on how to safely and responsibly regulate the marijuana industry, but specifically to turn these concepts that I think most people agree on in terms of criminal justice reform and giving these communities a fair shot into practical policy that can be enforced in a way that is logical and transparent.
Very good. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Eric Sterling, the Executive Director of the Criminal Justice Policy Foundation. And I was reflecting, I'm 68 years old, and so it was 50 years ago that I first started smoking marijuana as a college freshman. I first testified for marijuana decriminalization in 1976 when I was a law student in Pennsylvania. So for 42 years of my career as a lawyer, I've been an advocate for reform in one form or another. I was a public defender and ran a normal chapter in the late 70s. And then I had the amazing opportunity to get hired by the House Judiciary Committee, Crime Subcommittee in 1979 to try to write federal law, and became a colonel in the war on drugs as a House Democrat during the Reagan years. My boss supported medical cannabis in 1982. That became one of my professional responsibilities, to learn about medical cannabis and to be an advocate for that. I had helped Bob Randall, the first legal federal patient, start the Alliance for Cannabis Therapeutics in his apartment on 8th Street. I left the judiciary, and I have to give Cato credit. Cato ran seminars during the 80s in their office across from the Library of Congress, and I would go over at my lunchtime to get indoctrinated by liberty working for the Congress. In 1989, when I started the Criminal Justice Policy Foundation, it was clear that we needed many different aspects of reform. And so I helped create the Families Against Mandatory Minimums to fight mandatory minimums. I helped start the Marijuana Policy Project and other groups. I've been involved with SSDP on their board since 2004. In 2013, Governor O'Malley named me to the Maryland State Medical Cannabis Commission. So I was, like Shalene, a medical cannabis bureaucrat for 4 years. I'll simply say that, I'm concerned. I've learned over these years that the heart of the criminal justice system is about the dehumanization of offenders. And so I hope we'll be talking then about what the reform of that might mean. And I'm just so proud to be with these very distinguished panelists at the first National Cannabis Policy Summit here at the museum on 4/20/2018. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, we heard a little bit from Nyambi about what the drug war looks like on a personal and family level. A lot of people seem to think that marijuana is becoming sort of normalized, it's not a big deal, and that people aren't going to jail for this, and certainly not going to prison for a long time. But it is still a driver of a massive amount of interactions with the criminal justice system. And before we get into a little bit about the ways to sort of fix that and restore communities, I wanted to ask Clark and Eric, since it's your guys' wheelhouse, a little about the bigger picture view of what the drug war looks like now and how marijuana is still driving a lot of these interactions with criminal justice.
So it's an extraordinarily important issue to focus on because, as some of you may know and may have been mentioned already, there were more marijuana-related arrests in 2016 than for all violent crimes combined. So you've got law enforcement dedicating its resources and its attention to a total non-issue, while the national clearance rate for all violent crimes combined is less than 50%. The national clearance rate for homicides about 50 years ago was 90%. Now it's down to 61%. In places like Baltimore, it's far below that. And so the existence of marijuana laws on the books has one effect of incentivizing law enforcement to engage in fundamentally pointless activity. It also, as you noted, increases the amount of contact between law enforcement and citizens in sometimes extremely dangerous and fraught circumstances. For those of you who remember Philando Castile, the gentleman who was killed in Minnesota last year, the officer who shot him during that traffic stop testified that he became afraid because he smelled marijuana in the car, and he thought, somebody who would smoke marijuana in front of his girlfriend and a young child who was also in the car must be some kind of a deadly, dangerous criminal. And so it would be impossible to list all of the ways in which the existence of marijuana laws fundamentally pathologizes the criminal justice system and the interaction between citizens and law enforcement, which would be so much better if these laws weren't on the books.
Right. Yeah.
Clark, I think you laid it out very clearly. Enormously wasted resources, and enormous costs then to innocent civilians. It is part of a dehumanization. It is part of the legislature's misunderstanding of its moral authority, that the moral authority of the government to take our liberty away is only when the conduct is wrongful, that it hurts other people, interferes in their rights. Everyone in our audience understands that to use cannabis is not wrongful, and that the legislature will authorize the police to take our liberty away, and that the police will so readily do this, that the prosecution will so readily do this in the name of the law, reflects that our whole understanding of what the power of the law is has become distorted in the society. And so our work in reforming cannabis laws really shines a light on what is the authority of lawmakers.
The legitimacy.
What is their legitimacy? And it is, in the other sense, highly destructive because we all delegitimize all of law enforcement by its enthusiastic embrace of this wrong law.
Right. Well, Charlene and Yambi, you guys are both in Boston. And in Massachusetts, there was a lot of debate and discussion when they were talking about legalization, about what should be done to restore or how much of this money should go back into the communities that have been affected by the drug war. And as you're referred to as a marijuana bureaucrat now and as an activist, I'd like to hear you guys' perspectives on that debate and what solutions have been proposed and what's being done.
Sure. Well, let me say first that I think a really interesting kind of side conversation that's been touched upon is when we have these brand new agencies starting from scratch thinking about policies, it gets you thinking about how we can be more modern in the way that we enact policy and in terms of civic engagement. When our agency gets feedback from people, we try to be as modern as possible. I am an appointed government official, but I'm still an activist and I'm still a millennial. And I get a lot of information from places like Twitter, where I know a lot about marijuana. I don't even know much about anything else because I've been focused on marijuana for so long, but I absolutely don't know everything. And so when we're looking at a policy, we will get as much feedback as possible. We certainly want feedback from people who are in the underground market, right? Because we don't want to be talking about those communities as though they're not there and they're not part of the conversation. So I will very often get tweets from people who tell me that they're in the underground market and what something looks like, and then make a decision based on that. So in Massachusetts, we have I would say there's three main ways that we've chosen to address this. The first way is trying to weave into every decision that we make the fact that we want to encourage small businesses and people who might be in the underground market. So when I was a practicing marijuana business lawyer, back when the medical program in Massachusetts had just passed, people would come into my office and say, I want to be an entrepreneur. Can you give me a consultation of how it works? And I would start with, well, there's a $30,000 non-refundable application fee. And they're like, okay, well, what's your charge for 2 minutes because we're done here? And you have to really think about that, because if you have an equity program and an econ empowerment program like we do, but you're charging these huge application fees, you're charging for seed to sale tracking software, there's no way to find funding, then those programs don't mean anything. So we were very careful to stop in every single decision and think about how we can encourage small businesses. That's number one. Number two, the Econ Empowerment Priority Program that we have in Massachusetts is a way to ensure that the industry gets started off on the right foot. And so in most states, I think rightfully so, existing medical dispensaries are the first to enter the industry because they're already started and they already know how to grow and sell the plant. But at the same time, we also want to make sure that people who get a head start and have a market advantage are people who have demonstrated that they've worked with these communities and that they have good business practices. So that's something we instituted in Massachusetts. The deadline was just Sunday, and we're now going through these applications for priority certification and letting businesses that can demonstrate that they have this type of past experience to go first. And then third, we have an equity program. That one is not about going first. It's an ongoing program. And the idea there is if you are from a community that has been disproportionately harmed by prohibition, and these communities were designated through a study we commissioned looking at arrest data throughout Massachusetts before and after decriminalization. If you are from one of those communities, or if you have a drug conviction, or if your parent or spouse had a drug conviction, then we want to give you some extra help. So you would have help finding funding, you would help with you'd have help with technical assistance on filling out your application, and then ongoing business help as well. So those are the three programs. The last thing I would say is I think this is very much a groundbreaking area of policy that's going on around the country. And so I'm very open to having a dialogue with other activists and agencies who are looking into this. If you want to see what Massachusetts did, we've put forth a lot of guidance and summaries. So if you go to masscannabiscontrol.com and click on guidance and equity, you can see the details of all of these programs.
Great.
And
I'm envious.
Yeah. Yeah, Shalene's doing great work, and one of the things I think are the challenges. One of the things I think that we've highlighted as challenges is kind of that gap between the population that is devastated, you know, and making sure that they have access, because if you're in devastation, it's hard for you to even be a business owner. It's hard for you to kind of have the supports if there's no you know, two parents in the household. And so when you're trying to start a business, these are the gaps that exist that, you know, I would love to work with and figure out how we fill those gaps, because people are starting from below ground zero, you know, and trying to do this. And so I definitely want to make sure that that we're very much intentional about, not only as we start to create legislation, around just getting people into the business, we should also look at how do we support these communities? What, you know, what programs do we put in place to help the youth that are affected by these communities, so that, you know, because they don't have a father in the home, or because they you know, their parent is dealing with some other aspect, that they can grow up and be emotionally supported, because there's a lot of emotional breakdown in these communities. I have four nieces and nephews that now have to visit their father in a hospital. And so what does the support look like? And I think that we have to think about just simple things that are a privilege. When you can go and go to summer camp, and you can afford to go to summer camp, when you can do simple things like go to school and have a space where you can do homework, because maybe your family can't afford to have a house that's big enough so you have a quiet space to have some of these, I think, simple luxuries that we overlook. I remember someone joked and said, we can't use any of these tax revenues to build a playground, and I'm like, why not? Those are things that we take for granted. I think when you have this kind of privilege of having simple normalcy in your life, there's a lot of us that when you're living in these particular communities, they don't exist. And so we have to kind of have a lens on just putting, supporting the nonprofits that are providing these programs to the communities, supporting the nonprofits that also, whether it's programs for enrichments in the schools, looking at how we can support public schools. I taught in Boston Public Schools for 10 years. And I just read the headlines, in the summer, and it was like 50% budget cut. So all of the programs, the music programs, all the things that are outlets for students that are affected by this are now being cut. And now it's just back to the basics. And now you have kids that do not want to come to school. They had a reason that they wanted to come to school, but now they don't want to because some of these programs are being cut. And so I know that the business side is very important, but there's going to continuously be a gap if we don't actually uplift those communities in its totality.
Yvonne, you were speaking pretty forcefully about this earlier. When I look at the radical bills in the Senate and the stuff that like Cynthia Nixon is proposing, it's marijuana legalization with expungement, basically. There's another bill in the Senate that goes a little bit further, but is expungement enough, and what other things do we need to be thinking about with this legalization and how we use those funds and how it affects these communities that have been ravaged by the drug war?
So MCBA's done expungement clinics up and down the West Coast where we pay for the legal fees associated with folks getting their records expunged. Unfortunately, in a state like Colorado, you can't expunge records unless you incurred them as a minor. And when you go to adulthood, you can get them wiped clean. Otherwise, you can just do record sealing, which is really unfortunate because if you seal a record and that's what they see when they're doing a background check, they're like, what's under there? And if it's just cannabis, you're probably better off keeping that on your record. But I've been very disappointed in Colorado and Denver about how we spent our tax money. I think first we got kind of swindled into voting for legalization based on the first $40 million going to school construction. I think on the surface it sounds great, but where we need money in schools right now is in teacher salaries and in our school supplies, which is not happening. That money's not going there. It's going to contractors that are being overpaid to do capital projects in schools that don't need them. Second, I think we've lost sight of all the things that are still very much broken after legalization. As somebody that's been involved in it for 13 years as an activist and an advocate and then entered into the entrepreneurial space, I've seen so many people that were on that same path as me totally forget about their roots in activism and advocacy. And to know that in Colorado still we have a racial disparity when it comes to arrests and citations associated with public consumption. Why are people being arrested and cited for public consumption? Because we don't have places to consume them, to consume cannabis. And why are they primarily people of color? Because that's where cops patrol, unfortunately. I passed a social use bill my office led in Denver a couple of years ago that was meant to try to cure that. And when the city rolled it out, we had put distance requirements on 1,000 feet from the perimeter of these two schools, which is just like dispensaries. We thought that was reasonable. The city, when they went through rulemaking, added parks and rec centers and treatment centers and playgrounds and pools and on and on and on until the only places where we could open these social use establishments were in the same poor neighborhoods, primarily filled with people of color that the city just a year prior had said were too concentrated with cannabis businesses and set a moratorium on licenses. We've also lost sight of the fact that on the public consumption piece, that HOA and landlords, we have almost no home ownership in Denver anymore because of the cost of housing increasing so dramatically the last few years. People are renting, they can't consume in their homes. They are getting kicked out, even if it's not criminal. They are getting kicked out for using a legal substance. There are people that live in subsidized housing that can't consume cannabis. We have 70 million tourists every year that come to Colorado that can't consume cannabis legally, all while our city is advocating for us being able to drink full-strength alcohol in our parks, which just blows my mind. We have a mayor that's never stepped foot inside a regulated cannabis business in the 7 years that he's been mayor while we've had this industry grow up. So there's all these things that are still broken that we're not focusing on, and a lot of that goes back into the schools too, where our public school system in Denver is 80% people of color. Our charter schools are a lot more white. These schools have become ground zero for crackdown on cannabis possession. We have drug dogs that go into our public schools all over the place and find these, and kids just aren't getting a slap on the hand, they're getting expelled and suspended. And we know that that is not a way for children to get an education. These have gone up 10x, 12x in Denver since legalization, and nobody seems to be talking about that, and I think that's incredibly unfortunate.
Right. We did an investigation into drug-free school zones in Tennessee, and 38% of Memphis is covered in 1,000-foot drug-free zones. So, and those carry enhanced sentences, which send people to jail for longer. So, I mean, this is all part of these overlapping problems. I think the police...
CJ, I just wanted to pick up on the expungement piece, because, you know, Kayvon talked about, you know, the clinics and the inadequacy, and expungement is good, but it doesn't really get to the heart of the matter. What I think we need are what I would call clean slate laws, which is that after 5 years, by law, you have no record. We say that it goes away, that you get, that what we right now have is a situation where every sentence is a life sentence, and it's absurd. I mean, with modern data, you never lose your sentence. Well, we must have a process that says there is a period at the end of the sentence. And that, you know, and as a matter of law then, you are free of any consequence of having once had a conviction, so that you get to say it, and we treat it that way.
Have any jurisdictions tried that? Has any states or jurisdictions done it?
No, we haven't gotten that far yet. It has not yet been sufficiently articulated, and of course, you know, it still reflects this fear that's in the society around who are the offenders. And the point is, of course, the offenders are all of us, and that there's nothing in particular about the background of this former offender as opposed to someone who is not yet an offender that means we should stigmatize them and set them up for special concern. In Maryland, our state cannabis law said if you have a felony drug conviction, you can't work in the industry. If you have a felony drug, so bing, 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 suddenly you've excluded a whole population just by sort of, and these kinds of laws reflect, you know, the legislature's suspicion. They were suspicious of patients. They were suspicious of the doctors, and they were deeply suspicious of the people going into the industry. And so we end up, you know, at least in Maryland, way overregulated. You know, we're overregulated with incredibly complicated, you know, rules involving security and so forth because of the suspicion that there's going to be fraud and dishonesty in some greater extent than any other kind of industry.
And I think we lose sight of the fact that you know, in Colorado, they like to tout that we've created like 30,000 regulated market jobs and ancillary jobs. Well, we also probably took away 20,000 from folks that were relying on distributing cannabis on a very small level to make ends meet, because they do have issues finding traditional jobs because of these criminal records, which is really unfortunate. And as someone that's been on the ground floor of 14 different jurisdictions that have executed these legalization laws, people aren't talking about equity. They're not talking about reinvesting in these communities because everybody's reinventing the wheel, talking about what about the kids, and what about driving, and what about packaging, and all the stuff that all these jurisdictions have already figured out. And if they just take their lessons, tell those people to shut up, and evolve this conversation, I think we could actually get somewhere, and that's what groups like MCBA are trying, and a lot of different groups are trying. But unfortunately, we're not getting traction because those few loud people that are saying, what about the kids, are getting all the attention.
Right. I just want to go back one quick question, and then we're going to go to some Q&A for you guys. You're talking a little bit about suspicion and things like that. In New York City, 86% of the marijuana arrests were minorities, which is a pretty stunning number. And there was, I think, about 16,000 of them. Would you mind talking a little about policing? I want to talk about this bias here, because there's bias in policing. There's also bias in the industry itself and who gets licenses and things like that. And I wonder if you guys would.
Well, I think there's no question that marijuana laws enable a lot of what we might call policing by proxy. And so the police suspect that a particular person is a bad person, is engaged in a lot of criminal activity, but they can't prove it. But the marijuana law prohibition becomes, low-hanging fruit. So, we can't get the person for what we claim that they did, but we can bust them for marijuana. You mentioned the drug-free school zone situation in Tennessee. I think actually Reason reported on this, that in some settings, law enforcement, when they're setting somebody up through a confidential informant to do a drug buy, the confidential informant will propose moving the transaction into a school zone in order to enhance the penalty, which starts to look a lot like entrapment, and frankly is probably a kind of a species of entrapment. So having these marijuana laws on the books facilitate this kind of, I would say, blatantly immoral policing by proxy, where you're essentially saying, well, I think you're a bad person, but I can't get you for the thing that I think you did, so I'm going to, jam you up on a marijuana charge, even though there's nothing at stake there. For society, of course, there's a great deal at stake for the defendant.
Yeah, to pick it up, there's a great deal at stake for the cops, because they get paid overtime. In Montgomery County, Maryland, the cops, when they're subpoenaed for court, get an automatic 3 hours of overtime pay, even if they're excused by the prosecutor. So every time their case is called, they know they're getting overtime pay. And so you can witness this. A cop will make a stop, he'll call for backup, more guys show up, they're all in the police report, they all get subpoenaed, they all get the overtime pay. It's called collars for dollars. So it's an extremely profitable. The other thing it's very important to recognize is that marijuana prohibition is like the Swiss Army knife for law enforcement. That if I'm a cop, I have a suspicion, a hunch that these people are dirty, and I go, okay, get them out of the car, I get them to search the trunk, and I find contraband, I find weapons, I find burglary tools. Well, now how do I justify that? Well, I smelled marijuana. I was looking for marijuana. When marijuana is legalized, this thing that allows the Fourth Amendment to be violated blatantly and widely is eliminated. And so cops are holding on to this one magic tool that allows them to justify, illegal searches.
Let me add one thing. If we must not talk about collars for dollars without talking about policing for profit, which refers to civil forfeiture, which is a practice by which police can take your property, including your car, your phone, cash, even your house, by merely alleging that it was involved in some criminal activity, but never actually proving it. And civil forfeiture is, I think, one of the most corrupt and corrupting policies in America today. And there's no question that marijuana prohibition is a gateway crime for substantial amounts of civil forfeiture.
Right. Pro tip. Do not take large amounts of money through the airport. They will take it from you. We got about 10 minutes left, and I know you guys probably have some great questions for our panelists, so we got microphones out here. Where are they at? I see, yeah, you're right there. We got microphones coming around? Here, we got a mic coming.
How you guys doing?
Good, good.
Tori Wallace with We Baked and Cage Free Cannabis. So 13 to 15 years ago, I know for Shalene and Kayvan and Eric before I was even born. So just to talk between 13 and 15 years, now those millennials are now 27 to 30 years old. So what blueprint has been left? What foundation has been left for anyone to see what you've done with your grassroots in order to go back in door to door to inform people of what's going on? I ask that because DC in the past 31 days, we've had 4 expungement events. I live in one of the last wards standing due to gentrification. No one was informed. The general counsel that was just here on behalf of Mayor Bowser, they're having an expungement clinic right now. She didn't inform anyone. Where is the disconnect? How do we stop it from happening? Who is speaking on behalf of the minorities and the people in these communities? If we don't know, if we don't have social media, I wouldn't be here. We don't know.
The short answer is that the government does a crappy job publicizing its own events. You know, they're not very, they're not, you know, I see it all the time in my county, you know, that official events are not well publicized. You have to be following things very closely already to sort of know that there's going to be a hearing, a meeting, a forum.
I think they do a terrible job of communicating with the public in general, let alone events, about information that comes out. I personally, as somebody that's in the industry and has been in the industry for a long time, is very disappointed in most of the cannabis industry that's regulated right now. Believe it's incumbent on them. Those people have that opportunity to make money, to be in this for profit legally, because of what folks have done the last few decades trying to turn this around, to fight for legalization, to fight for this reform. It is incumbent on them to understand that they only have this opportunity because of those people, and they should be educating. They should be going to the city, going to the state, and understanding when these are, and pushing that out to their people. If they, you know, as somebody, again, that's worked in so many of these merit-based application processes and helped people win licenses, people promise a lot of stuff when they apply for these licenses and do not effectuate that stuff on the back end. And I think if they did, that this would be a far different place and people would be far more educated than they are today. But there are other great organizations like SSDP that we mentioned earlier that is doing a phenomenal job with building awareness on college campuses with young people that have been a bit disconnected from what's happened the last 10 years, that might have been a little too young to care about it quite yet and be informed about it. I think those are some of the brightest, hardest working minds that we have, and they're growing larger every day in their influence and the people that they're touching.
Good.
That is such a great question. That's something I feel extremely passionate about. I think there is an attitude inside the government often that you pass something like allowing expungement and you have an expungement clinic, and then everybody should just feel happy and show up, right? And of course they don't show up, and that leads to a snowballing that doesn't help anything. In Massachusetts, we as a movement have spent years cultivating relationships with community organizations and establishing authenticity and credibility such that when people do show up, they get to see their results. We had a workshop for our Econ Empowerment Program last week in Roxbury, Massachusetts, and there were 3 times as many people as could fit in the room that showed up. People with criminal backgrounds, people in the underground market, exactly the people we were trying to serve. And that could never be done, you know, the month beforehand. You have to put years into it. And the last thing I'll say about that is, it really struck me earlier when Eric said, this is all on a foundation of dehumanizing people who use or sell drugs or who have drug offenses. I think when you have these events, and I've seen this firsthand, and you're a policymaker and no one in your world, you know, intersects with this world, you're just imagining something scary. So if you can do a good job of getting people to show up and have that one-on-one interaction, so then you're thinking about, you know, should we exclude people with convictions? You're not picturing someone scary, you're picturing that person that you met. It makes such a big difference in the decision making. So it couldn't be any more important to have these events correctly and to set up a form of authenticity that's ongoing.
Getting their question here.
Up here, in the center.
In the center?
Waving right upstairs. My question goes out to all of you regarding your background issues. I am a felon, and it was because of cannabis. I did 4 years because of it. My question is, I'm in the middle of an application right now from Massachusetts. How do I get over this road bump, please? All of you, any of you. I want to be legit. I want to be totally, you know, straightforward. I work for a group in New York City called High NY. We help our New York State people, you know, who have records. Expungement doesn't really work, you're right. And sealing them, can't figure it out. It's like $10,000 and it won't guarantee you anything. So please, any insights to any of you, especially you, young lady from Massachusetts, you know who I'm talking to. How can I get over this road bump? Thank you.
It just happened, what I just said, exactly. We need people to show up at items like this and ask these questions. So what road bump are you trying to get past? I didn't catch that.
I have a felony conviction.
For marijuana?
Yes.
Okay, so.
Nothing else, just large possession.
Okay, so in Massachusetts, there is no road bump. In fact, you specifically cannot be excluded from the Massachusetts industry for that. Not only that, you can apply for priority because you have a drug conviction. Not only that, you can apply for the equity program and get extra technical assistance.
All right. We are running short. We got time for like one question. Get up. You get that?
So I have questions.
Please use the microphone.
Hello?
There you
okay,
go.
that's right. Okay, awesome. So I have a question about the new up-and-coming entrepreneurs like myself. What can I do now, starting today, to, like I said, help the community, and not just start today, but implement that into my business so it can last longer and it can always apply?
One thing that I would recommend is getting involved in the Minority Cannabis Business Association, selfishly. No, I think it's, I've noticed in a place like Denver especially that's incredibly white, that people of color do not feel comfortable in the cannabis industry. When you go to cannabis events, they don't even show up. So when MCBA held a networking event a couple years ago after a Women Grow event, and week's notice in a place that I'd never been to, 150 people of color showed up out of nowhere. I didn't even know there were that many people of color in Denver, honestly. And I think they're just striving for a network. We held an opportunity summit at the University of Denver that I helped lead a couple months ago that was there for just this issue, to help young entrepreneurs, to help young advocates find their pipeline into the industry, to find their conduit. And I think that it's a great place to deal with other folks that are going through the same issues, that are trying to find the same value in this industry. It may not just be having a license. There's so many ancillary opportunities in not just packaging and point of sale systems, but events and social use establishments and culture and fashion and music, and it's really endless. And I think helping people find out that there are other opportunities that aren't being pursued that are lower capital, but still have a huge upside and are probably more culturally appropriate to the folks that want to get in, I think that's a wonderful place to start. And also to be working with folks that understand, just like SSTP folks do, that this is much bigger than business. That there's a social obligation to the businesses that we run, and that's the kind of community we're trying to create at MCBA.
CJ, could I take just a few seconds to sort of address that question of, can cannabis heal the criminal justice system?
You have 15 seconds.
Okay, so I want to say that, that I think that the drugs that are really going to heal the criminal justice system are heroin and the opioids, because that epidemic is leading to understanding the humanity of people who are suffering. And that we're now really in a cultural moment where the drug problem is being reconfigured around the country because of the extent of this kind of tragedy. And that once we understand once we accept the humanity of people who are using drugs, once we begin to say the purpose of drug laws should be to minimize suffering instead of being around offending, then we're going to have, I think, the kind of healing we hope to have.
Well, people only care because it started affecting rich white communities, right? Heroin's been hurting people for a long time.
Oh, yes.
They did not start caring until it started affecting suburban white communities.
Any final words?
No, I think that we all need to understand that there's powers in numbers. And so a lot of people showed up, by themselves and asking how can they get into the industry. And so this is a time where you have to unite. You have to look for different networks to be a part of, to really make change. And this is a most important time where, joining different organizations, SSDP, Minorities for Medical Marijuana, all of the organizations that are out here doing the work, show up and have the support to really make the change that needs to be made.
Great. Why don't you guys give our panelists a big hand?
going to take a 20-minute break. We'll see you back here in 20 minutes.